Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls of all ages. I'm your host, Grant Magic, the host of Virgan Radio Service, obviously, which I've just stated because I'm an idiot. Also the dictator of the Republic of New Strathclyde. That piece of music was by Jim Yosef and Roy Knox, called Sun Goes Down, an NCS release, which you can find in the description below if you wish to view it again. Today I'm joined by actually three people. It's been a long time since I've had more than one person on this. First of all, I'm Dan Morris, President of New Westphalia.
Good evening.
Ashton Mattingly of the Crimson Soviet Republic.
Howdy.
And Joe, I'm still trying to get the hang of this. Joe Gagermeister.
I can pronounce it. It is Gagermeyer, but I appreciate your attempt. Hello, everybody.
Joe Gagermeyer of Liberstein. How are you today, gentlemen?
I'm fine. I'm still kicking, still alive.
Yeah. Excellent.
I'm alright. I'm just vibing.
I am also alive.
Good. We're all alive. That's excellent. I myself am still dying a little bit since yesterday. For those of you who watched my episode on Bigfoot yesterday, I was dying a little bit there. I'm also dying a little bit again today. I'm not particularly well at the moment. So today we are talking a little bit about the geofiction that yourself, Dan, you run that server, and Joe, you're obviously a huge part of it as well. No comments?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I suppose I do run the server, and we do a lot of really cool things in there.
Yeah. Dan, is it possible that
Indeed.
you can turn up your microphone a little bit?
I can try. Let me go to the sensitivity. Is that better?
Yeah, that's much better. Thank you. I just want people to be able to hear you. The only thing I'm guilty of is kidding.
What?
Anyway, yeah. So you guys do the geofiction again. As I just stated, Dan, you run that server, you run that project, and again, Joe, you're obviously a big part of that. Ashton has currently no association to that server and is not a part of the server. He just really wanted to be here.
Why not? Like, you know.
I've got no objection to
Enthusiasm
it.
is
No one
an
else has
amazing
any
trait.
objection to it. So yeah. Anyway, yeah, it's great to have all you guys on the server. Long-time friends, of course. On the server, I mean, and on the show. So yeah, let's get a little bit into let's get a little bit into depth and detail about the geofiction. Tell me what you are currently doing with the geofiction, because I've seen that you are actually talking a little bit about possible projects.
Well, Joe has just created a YouTube channel for us, and we're steadily talking about the ideas of doing these kind of little documentary style things which are in the world. So it would be essentially as if some director who is in the actual world is making a documentary about a certain country in the world. So it's like an in-character kind of drama documentary type thing, where we just kind of explain short histories which can be condensed into some map kind of simulations, just to explain some basic history behind some of the nation.
Yeah, I think I started that. Of course, a big influence being Kaiser Cat Cinema. Those are the guys that produced the Kaiserreich mod for Hearts of Iron 4. And they've got an amazing channel and, of course, a lot of traction. But so that was sort of the inspiration for that. But I think also with what we're doing, it's a really cool way to sort of maybe get people interested in something like this, or even get people interested in at least ours. Because I think we've fleshed out our world incredibly well. And I mean, we've been working on this since I only joined in last September, so it's been a long time. But you know, and I think the videos, not only of like what Dan said with the short documentaries, like I just recently made, it's about 8 minutes long. It's a miniature documentary on my country, which is the Upfelden Republic, and it's only a part of it. But also we've discussed maybe recording some like brainstorming sessions, and you know, not only to have that stuff on record for us to reflect on, but for people to sort of get an understanding of what we're doing and a better understanding of the world that we've created.
Yeah, you guys obviously have
sort of like a reflection on the creative.
Yeah.
I like.
Yeah, I think it would be like really fascinating to have like almost these kind of conversations where we're actually like discussing certain aspects and concepts of the world itself. Because usually having a late night call about these things, we talk about so much random stuff. And there's so many things which we get through, and there's so many interesting concepts we come up with. We just tend to forget them.
Yeah. I mean, just last night even, we had a really nice long conversation with a big group of people, which is unusual. Usually it's just two of us. But last night I developed almost, at least a big part of Upfelden's past with music history. So, as explained in the last episode where you guys talked about the geofiction, Dan explained the time, so it's 50-20 in our world, but in the 4970s, which is essentially the 1970s for the real world, Upfelden was involved in this quasi-Vietnam type war in a country called Sulu, which is in the region of the world known as the Far South. And I wanted this sort of counterculture movement to come from that, much like the Vietnam War. And I started, developing like bands, like rock bands, psychedelic rock bands that were popular and influential in the counterculture movement. So I think even adding stuff just as, simple as music history to your world can add a lot of depth, even if it's just I only have 2 bands that I've really talked about, 2 or 3 bands that I've introduced to this world, and you can just sort of even understand simply by looking at something or understanding that there is a development of music in this world, that it's something pretty special, I think.
Yeah, even the just the introduction of a certain genre of music has absolutely changed the atmosphere of that entire decade for your history.
Exactly. And, I had mentioned last night when we were talking that in Sulu, there's this sort of opioid type drug or opium-esque drug called copia, and that was a big part of the counterculture movement. And because, kids like to smoke copia and listen to, psychedelic rock music or whatever, when the war started, copia is not being shipped to Opfelden, of course, because they're at war with each other. They won't trade. So that's big part of the counterculture movement, is that people don't want the war to go on simply because they want to they want to smoke. But that's just part
That's a
of it.
very interesting concept.
Yeah, it's really annoying when these kids kind of do this, because I mean, tricks are for kids, not drugs.
I mean, not wrong at all.
I just
All
needed to
these-
put that in there because that was funny.
No, but back to what Joe was saying, like, yes, music is very influential in society. It's been influential for thousands of years, just about.
Yeah, and Jay, of course, who I forget his newest country, but formerly Wincote or Wincote, just made we were designing albums essentially last night. It was a big part of our discussion, and part of his culture is sort of like this Mongolian-esque nation. So he has like almost a throat singing choir, and he made like an album
That's
cover
cool
for
as
that.
shit.
It's really cool. I mean, just to see how music affects with culture and how that develops with the history of the world, but as well as its influence in the world. And I keep saying this, but I think it's really important to understand that some smaller details just make a project go from, okay, we're building a world, blah, 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 to, this is something that's been thought about. It's been a lot of care and love has been put into this and a lot of attention. So, and we work hard on it. It's something we're all proud of, I'm sure.
Definitely. You
Definitely,
guys
and we.
Sorry, you go first, Dan.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, definitely. We all have our own creative inputs into it. We all have different ideas, which we tend to play off of our kind of strengths. So mine is kind of the visual aspects, I'd say, because I'm really into finding ways of doing like Photoshops to give the kind of reader or the players kind of something to imagine, and then kind of start putting the role play into their heads, and then they can imagine things better. And so I've been working with things like 3D architecture model, which I actually made a 3D showcase for each of like a bunch of locations, buildings, and cities in the world. And it's absolutely spectacular. It feels like a genuine like budget movie, because of the game engine that I've used, and I'm really proud of it. It's actually on the YouTube with the Odin documentary as well.
When I build my PC, I got to give that a look.
Yeah.
I think we each bring something different to it, and I think we have a pretty good cast of characters to work with on this server.
Yeah, I'd say Lewis is particularly interested in the linguistics side, because he's obviously bilingual, because his first language is Spanish, and he speaks English as well. And he's been helping us with some of like the language parts, because he's really interested in those bits.
Language has always been tricky for me. Like, I've been trying to learn Russian for close to 2 years now.
И говорит по-русски?
God damn it, Dan.
No idea.
Never mind.
Yeah, no idea what.
Trying
that
to
was. Yeah, so obviously you guys have put a lot of effort into to this server, and a lot of time into your individual nations, as Dan explained when he was on the last time. You guys don't just run the one nation. You guys create and run many, and the ones that you do are actually run, or the ones that you put the most time into, and the ones that you don't actually run, are commonly known as NPCs, or non-player controlled characters. Um, so you put
Yeah, so at
obviously
the
the more that you come up with, the more character that you actually put into these nations, and that's obviously like an extremely good thing for to do for this server, because if more people come along, they see, all these different things, and how much character each nation has, and they think, well, seeing what you guys have done, maybe I can work and build on that and add a little bit more to this server.
Yeah, as we continue to add more nations to kind of fill the gaps that we've still got a few, but we've got well over, I think, 70, 80 nations, which we all kind of control portions of. But I kind of just keep creating them, and so I guess I'm in charge of most of them. But they're kind of like just filler nations. Like it's realistic to have like loads of small nations as well as the large ones. We originally went with the whole non-playable country thing because we started with like one nation each, so there was literally just like 5 countries in the world, like with the original people who were involved. And to look back on my computer in the files and see the original map that we did is just, it's crazy how far we've come to have all this detail which has been put into it. And so as we expanded the roster of nations, if you like, we started to realize there's not really much point saying that there are player nations and non-player nations. Like, people should be able to just control however many they like, just as long as it's not stupid, because there's so many different like terms which we've adopted, like from the nation state style roleplay. So that's nationstates.net, where a lot of people created nations like back in the day and then found micronationalism. So I was one of them, actually. I wanted to know about different ways of making countries, and I happened upon Molossia, and then here we are. But yeah, we decided to implement a lot of the forum-based roleplay rules. Like, for instance, there's god modding, which is a term which means that you can't talk about what another person is doing, what another person's belongings in the roleplay are doing, like the people, the nation, the animal, blah blah blah. Only you can describe your stuff, because if you are telling someone else what their people are doing, then that is wrong, because they should be able to do that. And so there's so many different other terms which we use. It just sometimes gets a bit heavy if someone's controlling like 20 nations and they're all in the same organization which has one goal. It tips the balance ridiculously unless you're being fair. And so you need to be fair in this environment, because losing is not a bad thing, because we've had rather childish people who seem to just want to win at literally everything, and they don't know how to roleplay losing, because you should lose well. Like, it's a good thing of roleplay. Nations can be destroyed through this, and that's great roleplay. And if someone can't do that, then they shouldn't be playing roleplay. Really.
Obviously, no.
I think
Losing.
part of it, a good example for that would be the like history of Upheld, and with the Second Sulu Wars, like we lost like big time, and it's a tiny country in the far south corner of the world, and this major world power can for some reason not make those tactical decisions that would allow a victory. And I think even role playing that, or just recently there's been a lot of tension in the same region with all sorts of different countries being involved. Like Tokugawa wants to attack, sort of. They've been threatening to attack, and it's all hanging in the balance essentially. One bad role play or even one good role play could lead to a bad decision, and that just makes everything much more interesting and more realistic. And it's
yeah.
just...
I mean, a lot of the time you think you know where it's going to go, but then the other person responds something you weren't expecting. And then you have to, it becomes exhilarating. Like, it's
exactly so like with Nangguo and myself. They were threatening to invade Sulu, and I have, of course, a responsibility to now protect the new Free Republic of Sulu or whatever. of course, they started initiating a naval blockade. So I had to do like this counter naval blockade, and for a while we had a pretty good back and forth going with all this growing tension.
It was actually really tense because we were all thinking it was going to end up in some kind of like world war, which was going to happen. But then, Bradley Dullahan, who controls Nanguo, he decided that his ships would just be bluffing, and so that kind of took us by surprise, and it changed the events completely. And so we were took off guard. Then it was crazy.
Yeah. Especially since, I had made, or Felden rather, had made deals with other countries nearby in Imteria, or rather Lower Imteria, which is more of a sub-region of that area, to sort of have this essentially mini coalition, or rather a mini alliance in Sulu. And there's thousands of troops from all these different countries that are now have been defending Sulu for almost 2 months probably, and there's been nothing happening other than there was a small rebellion. And they've been waiting for a massive global sort of scale of war, and then nothing really has been happening.
And it's really difficult because there's so much going on. Sometimes you have to kind of show that with the nations as well, because of course in the Falklands War, of course, it took so much money and so much manpower and everything for Britain to send a fleet down to the Falklands to retake them. We had the same thing with one of the nations I control, which is the Federal Republic of Odrovakia. The Odrovakians had a aircraft carrier stationed in Sulu because there's an alliance with Opfelden, and so they were maintaining peace there. And rebels in Sulu launched an aerial attack against the aircraft carrier. Now, the aircraft carrier was the only Odrovakian presence down there, so there wasn't really much for it to do. So eventually, I had to call it back because logistic. There's nothing in the roleplay that I could have done because of so many constraints. Like, it just wouldn't make sense for me to be able to marshal some kind of fleet to go down there with this kind of situation. I had to be realistic and just pull it straight back.
If I can just question you, now you guys have brought up the subject, or rather the word roleplay a couple of times. Now I have asked this question before to several people that have talked about this on the show. How does this roleplay differentiate from simulationism in the micronational community? Because someone might look at this server and say, well, this is all just simulationism, like, and your nations might just be simulationist along with it. Like what can you say to these people to reassure them that this is not the case?
I think I would say that it's simulationism done right. So essentially, we understand that this is completely fiction, and we are running it as a fiction, and we are role playing in a fictional world, and we don't have any
Geofiction.
you catch on. But we don't have any disassociation from what is real and what isn't, like some people do in the micronational community, because in the micronational community sometimes people mistake this kind of fiction for micronationalism. Like I was followed the other day on one of my accounts by a nation which apparently has been around since 1875, and its anthem is and its nation's anthem is like part of the Chronicles of Narnia soundtrack.
Really?
And when it was the flag of Spain.
Oh my god!
And I've genuinely seen like people go on Google Images and then post them on their Twitter feed and say, "Oh, this is our army." And it's literally just a Google image of some soldiers, and that kind of stuff. It leads me to think either they're trying to pretend to be something, or they've completely misunderstood what micronations are. Now, for the geofiction that we run, it's a creative process. We're the writing fiction, where essentially, if you collated all this stuff into a book, you could call it a fiction novel. Like we're creating stuff by role playing together. We're creating a series of stories and ideas and concepts in a fictional world, and we differentiate from simulationists in the micronational community because
Exactly.
those people are just being stupid.
Exactly. And I think
Yes.
just looking at this, and if you just look at the map, you could show someone the map. If someone was like, "Oh, this is simulation," if you just show the map, like, where on the world is this? They wouldn't be able to tell you because it's a fake map. It's just there's no real world circumstance here other than maybe someone getting a little angry that something happened in the game. And essentially, it's all it's writing with extra steps. Essentially, it's like we're having a fun time writing fiction and developing things, but at the same time, we're enjoying sort of playing a game almost. I think it's just a really fun, like Dan said, creative process, and there's a lot to do with it. And frankly, I think more people should be doing this because it eases tension. It's helped me a lot. I just have something to look forward to at the end of the day. Sometimes what I can come up with a story and anything goes essentially as long as it makes a little bit of sense in here. Anything goes, and it's just fun to have something to fall back on, something creative to do. You don't have to think up some new idea every single day to keep yourself busy. You have something to go to. And, to further that point, I mean, we have memes. It's fun to have like these inside jokes within a community and be able to make a meme that to anybody outside to these, like, other than these 12 people, no one else would understand what you're talking about. And it's a really awesome community.
Speaking of inside jokes, I've actually had a comment from the live chat, which I think you guys might find funny, but I'm not sure because I don't pay enough attention to the actual server. C Tava asks, when will the day of reckoning come for the Otvorian scum?
I have a feeling I know who that is. But that's really fascinating because that totally goes with what we're saying, that we've created like this mini community which we'd love to get more people in to create stuff with us and have fun with. We've done some like proper rivalries between some of our own nations. It's given rise to some beautiful memes and concepts and jokes and in jokes and it's brilliant.
I mean, if you just, it really is something pretty cool. And I'm scrolling through the meme server here, the meme channel rather, and there's so many good jokes. I mean, ranging from our history writing and people making fun of each other's history and just sort of making fun of current events and world leaders, stuff like that. It's just it's a really fun time. I mean, it's just something awesome.
Could you?
Oh, but
I mean,
sorry, I was just to say one quick thing.
Okay.
Because I do remember one time we all plotted against Max, but that never fell through.
Could you describe what this thing is? This reckoning for the Otvorian scum is?
Well, I assume that's Lewis, because his nation and Max's nation, Otvor, recently had a bit of a falling out. The falling out involved guns, and unfortunately, Lewis's nation had to unfortunately capitulate and allow Otvor to annex territory on its border, which has outraged, I think, that region. I'm a bit outraged because my nation has history with Otvor as well, like some really really serious history. Yeah, but it's great because then you feel really personally involved with these things, with your creations, and it just feels so right.
Yeah.
Really.
And to sort of go with that, and with Upfelden and Sulu, it's just essentially it's a joke on the global scale of Upfelden being involved with Sulu, but Upfelden takes it so seriously that like, you know, this is something that they've had for 100 years almost. This is something they're dedicated to, but everyone's making fun of them because, you know, it's this tiny backwater in the far south that's hardly a developed country, but they keep not only losing to, but you know, they're just so involved with this that it.
Yeah. Actually, I have had another question from the live audience. The Celtic Conlanger asks, "Where do I find the server? This sounds interesting."
Ooh. Well, basically just contact either myself or Joe or Grant,
Hello.
and we should be able to point you in the right direction.
Excellent. Okay. So I hope you found that response helpful.
Well, I mean, you can find me at New Westphalia or at President NW on Twitter if you have it. Yeah. So.
I don't even remember my Twitter handle. It's been a while. I'm sure it's
Yeah.
at Liberstein, but.
But the server itself is on Discord, though. By the way, if we didn't mention it. So you do have to have Discord to do this.
Yeah.
In time,
I should.
preferably people that are involved frequently stay around longer.
Yeah. So I think what's this? No borders. Actually, I have been given an image, but from Dan, which you should be seeing on screen now. Sorry, that was a little messy. I'm just trying to readjust it. This looks so bad.
By the way, that last one, that colourful one, don't do that one. Do this one. Sending.
Yeah. So.
Because that's slightly more detailed.
Yeah. Okay. Right.
So what you're seeing on the screen right now is it topography? Is it a topographical map? I think that's the term. Probably not. But this is what the world looks like, basically. I managed to whip this up in half an hour the other day. I'm very proud of it. It does look great. As you can see, rather large. We've got, did I say roughly like 70 or 80 nations at the minute?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we've got something around there, which inhabit most of the land that you're seeing on screen. We've got lots of different places with lots of different cultures. Those cultures can parallel cultures on Earth as well. So we've got things like Slavic type cultures. We've got German type cultures, Spanish type cultures, things like that. But they've evolved in different ways. They have different concepts. They have different attitudes. They have different ways of being, different attitudes on a global scale as well. Lots and lots of different parallels. Like I mentioned about the Falkland Wars. There was actually an event which I did with Odrovakia where there was a Falkland type situation down in the bottom left, with that big island and its surrounding little islands. That the Odrovakians had a base on one of those islands, and the nearest nation, which is called Tokugawa, you might have heard Joe mention about it. That actually invaded that island, and Odrovakia had to go and take it back. But instead of cooling off like the British did with the Argentinians after they won, Odrovakia managed to actually get ashore onto the Tokugawan mainland and hold basically the entire nation hostage by completely obliterating its defences and taking the government to ransom. And it was only through the intervention of one of our international organisations, it's called the Continental Coalition, that Odrovakia actually stepped down and retreated back to Odrovakia. So that enraged the Tokugawans after that, and they've never forgiven the Odrovakians after that. And that's something that I came up with to kind of mimic the Falkland War, but I changed it in a way which makes it quite interesting and fun to play with. Now, Tokugawa is one of my creations, so I also control Tokugawa. That's what we were talking about with the whole non-playable nation, because we want to be able to have people that can make stories without other people being online, if that makes sense. So we have our own nations, but we also have side nations that can interact with our main nation. So like we can make these interactions. So like Sulu is controlled by Joe and Opthoga. So he can have that history there, a back and forth with himself, just in the form of writing in prose. Um, just without anyone there, he can make up the stuff as he goes along. We can react to it, of course, as other nations, and we generally do in this kind of national headlines section, where we just kind of do little sentences just to say how different nations are reacting to different things. But then if we want to go into the larger roleplay, we then create an entire channel where we then are doing paragraphs to each other. And it's really detailed and it's really great.
Yeah.
Yeah, even with what Dan was saying with like his war with Tokugawa, Odravakia's war, excuse me. Felden was involved in that very minorly because we of course have an interest in the region with Sulu being so close. And if you look at the map where that big island is in the bottom left, and there's a little tiny set of islands in the middle of like a channel sort of with another bigger island above it. Sulu is in that channel. It's those tiny islands. And of course, we have an interest in the region, so we, obviously went to help, and that sort of has created some tension between us and Tokugawa. But even further back, there's some tiny islands north east of Tokugawa called the Dolomans, and Upfelden has had a long vested interest in that region as well. And at one point, Tokugawa had invaded the Dolomans, so of course, Felden having a military presence there. Went to war with Tokugawa. So there's adding this history to some of the stuff sets up, things that are going on currently. And as I mentioned, there's tension again in that same region because Tokugawa, is looking at the military occupation of Sulu as an infringement of sort of this cultural pact that they have in the far south. And like I said, there's all that history there.
Yeah, there's a parallel of the Asian Co-Prosperity organization, which was around in World War II. We've got this thing called the Far South Prosperity Pact, which is made by several of the Japanese-style nations, which are on that larger island. And so they've formed a pact together to expel these disgusting barbarian northerners from their holy lands. So nothing's really happened with the invasion of Sulu, but something which I found really interesting is to change the culture slightly, so that you're not mimicking exactly the modern nation equivalent. So I wasn't mimicking Japan as it were. What I've done is I've made it seem like the samurai kind of culture never grew old and died off. What if you had camouflage, like modern camouflage, on top of samurai and Ashigaru armor? Like what would happen if you had modern mechanized infantry versions of samurai? What would happen if you had a D-Day style amphibious landing by mechanized samurai? Like, those kind of things in your head are just beautiful. Like, coming up with those kind of things. And then you have the opportunity to write about it and put it into your readers' heads. And it's beautiful, and I can't wait to do that. I just need to get my motivation, and then we will do this strange D-Day style mechanized amphibious landing by samurai who have katanas and like modern versions of them, and obviously then the opposing army would have to deal with melee infantry, so they would have their own training and stuff. And so changing just the little tactics actually changes the way that your armies fight, which changes their traditions, which changes their outlooks and their looks and what they're dressed in and how they approach battle and strategy and things. It changes everything, and it's so fascinating to explore this stuff.
And to that point, what Dan said about strategy with the sort of mechanized, sort of modernized samurai is I sort of mentioned that with the war in the Dolomens between Upfelden and Tokugawa, the Tokugarans were pretty successful because they were getting up close and personal with soldiers that were trained in ranged combat. So there was a big wave of success before anybody could even be trained to fight hand-to-hand combat.
Exactly. So Opfelden had to adapt its military strategies to cope with melee infantry. So
exactly.
They had to change their equipment and maybe armor or something, and in order to repel mechanized samurai. I mean, it's just so fascinating.
I have actually put a new image on screen, guys.
I see that there. Yeah.
So this second image is basically just obviously a border version of the map that you just saw. This is one of the ones where we're still adding the nations into the kind of green bits, as you can see, but everything with a name and a flag next to it is a nation which is in there already, and we've already thought of flags and histories and cultures and attitudes for most of these. There's only a few which just have a name, but it's very pretty, and it's getting there. We're nearly full. Kind of.
Again, if anyone at home finds this interesting and wants to join, you can contact Dan, Joe, or even myself. Or maybe you can just contact Ashton if you can't be asked with us. That was just for jokes.
If you're absolutely completely not interested, talk to Ashton.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I would like to start talking maybe a little more about sort of the cultures that we've developed, and maybe more of a general sense, of course. And if you look at of course, Imteria or the old Erststadt, and even sort of Odrovakia, and it's
maybe you could describe just plainly to the layman like what the old kind of empires that preceded a lot of these countries was.
Yeah, so using this map as sort of a detail, you can see Upfelden in the big red country in like the sort of central region, and if you go sort of northwest, sort of diagonally almost up to a little country called Stornland, which is above that big gray area. That a lot of those tiny countries there, and including Stornland and Upfelden, were part of an old empire called the Erststadt, which is sort of a name that historians came up with because it was sort of this first major empire on a global scale. So it's essentially they named it to the first state, and it reigned for a pretty long time, not exactly 1,000 years, a little shy of 1,000 years, from I think in our world timeline 3,800 to 4,300, and it's expanded greatly in this massive empire. It's not exactly the Roman Empire. That was, of course, more of the Interior Empire is a parallel to that. So I don't even know if there really would be a real world parallel for the Erststadt that unless someone else can think of.
When me and Zar came up with it, it was basically the idea that what if it wasn't Rome and Latium that then spread across Europe? What if it was actually what if it was actually the Suebi and the Germanians that spread across and did this kind of
thing? Which is a good point to bring up, because I've not mentioned at all that the Erststadt is, of course, a Germanic sort of themed and based culture, and that, of course, affects a lot of the countries. Upfelden and Stornland, of course, are very Germanic sounding names, and the countries in between, Nordfelder, Zeegard, the Zerstig Empire, stuff like that, or Zerstig Confederation, excuse me, all sort of Germanic sounding names. And by 4,300, the sort of empire collapsed. It spread itself too thin. I gave a brief overview of this in the Upfelden documentary, if you go and watch it, of course. But
cheeky plug.
But Upfelden is sort of born from this. There's things happening across the former Erststadt where countries are figuring out whether they want to make unions or just break off and remain independent bodies, or try to build this empire again. And Affelden is sort of the last place to do that. They, of course, are just part of the northern reaches of where it is now. They decide after a neighboring state, rather, a province called Deno breaks away as independent and forms a principality. They decide they'll gather their land and form it into one empire, and they create a monarchy called the Opfen Empire, which lasts, I think, from 4300 to 4832. So it's a 530 some years roughly of a monarchy under the Frond family, and so that sort of forms the basis of Opfelden's history, and that's the roots leading up to its creation.
Yeah.
So there's a lot there. There's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, we are actually getting into.
So a lot of it is just kind of finding strange and slightly new parallels, which we can just slightly change. Like, for instance, those smaller countries, which probably looks to you like a very strange version of Africa, like with how similar looking they are. We actually thought, well, wouldn't it be quite interesting, instead of Africa being the kind of French and English and Dutch kind of inspired place, what if it was mostly inspired by German kind of culture? What if you had Africa colonized by a Germanic middle-aged nation, and then those nations that you see there broke off and formed their own kind of German-speaking states? What would that look like? Stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. And of course, then we have the Imterians, which is greatly influenced by more of the Roman Empire parallel, except Lower Imteria. Lower Imteria is quite unique because it's, of course, influenced by Opfelden and sort of the bordering Erststadt, because I can't remember what the years are, because I had no part in forming the Imterian Empire. But
I think we made a mistake somewhere, and it looked like the Imterian Empire was before the Erststadt. So that kind of didn't really help the fact that was the first empire, because it wasn't. So we needed to work that out.
Yeah, and of course, I think we discussed at one point that there was a possibility that they had overlapped at one point in time, and they could have gone to war over sort of that lower Imterian region, which is to the north right of Opfelden. There you can see that there's that pink, yellow, and blue and orange countries there. And of course, the lower portions of that are more Germanic sounding, so Saarbrück, Zersteig, and then you have more Italian sort of sounding names with Forlia, Bergliano, and Castelloggia, and as well as Montetrio, which is a little tiny country right next to Opfelden. So there's kind of an interesting meld there of both of the empire's influence.
Yeah, it's also really, really fascinating to look at how historians themselves would look at these things. Like, for instance, it's really fascinating to think, would historians have postulated the ideas of why the Erststadt and the Imterian Empire never actually had a single military conflict? And there could be hundreds of novels and documentaries on the subject of the interactions between the two great empires of the time, and why they never actually met in battle, and the fascination in the historical community over those things. And the idea is that you can actually, in this whole fiction, you can look at what people don't know and what people are investigating, because you're investigating it too, but it's just so fascinating to be like, oh, we've discovered this today.
Yeah.
I'm actually getting into live audience question time, so if any audience members from the live audience do have any questions for our guests, please type your questions in the chat box, and we will get to them as soon as possible. We can continue.
Yeah, I was just going to mention, I think part of that, what Dan had just said about why there was no, military interaction, is we had talked about, I think that night that we sort of talked about that whole idea about, the Roman Empire and, ancient Chinese empires existing at the same time, and this possibility that, at one point the Romans and ancient Chinese traders probably had bumped into each other, perhaps on the Silk Road, and that sort of was an interesting idea. And why was there no sort of major war between them? Of course, we know why, but there could have been, I guess, a war between ancient Rome and a Chinese Empire. But I see there is a question.
Yeah, C. Tava asks, why was there a Great War, as in referring to World War One?
So we had this interesting idea. We didn't have a World War One as such. So we decided we had a World War Two type calamity that affected the world in such a large way that obviously the Second World War did. So what we did was we changed it into a geological disaster, it was like a volcanic event that happened. Let's say it was like what's that huge pocket of lava below North America? Is that the
Is it like the Yellowstone supervolcano sort of thing?
Yellowstone. So what would happen if the Yellowstone kind of situation blew up? Basically, what would happen if a series of natural disasters made its way around the world in such a way that destroyed much of everything, and almost every nation was affected in some way, because you had lava flows which led to maybe fissures, and then earthquakes, which of course then leads to tsunamis. And so there's this huge kind of this huge natural event which people had to come back together to get over. And so what happened was, whilst that was happening, there was coordination which was being done with several of the most powerful nations at the time, who then decided to formalize that kind of cooperation into what we then later called the Continental Coalition, which then presided over a huge military operation to secure something, because there was this huge other event as well. They were kind of both connected, but we had a version of World War II's huge calamitous effect on the world, and then we had a military occupation, which was an alliance going against another alliance, because of what had happened in this calamity. There's a lot of detail in this kind of situation, but we did have this huge wake-up call style series of events. There wasn't a kind of First World War as such. I think a lot of our countries have kind of just been fighting each other because they can, and it's never really gotten to the point where huge super blocks formed, until this calamitous event where a coalition starts recruiting members and has more than half of the world is in it, but it's kind of failing in some ways. And so we thought it would be quite interesting to have this like really powerful international organization. It would be like the UN, but its attitude is way different from the UN. It tries to be good and hopeful and everything, but it does have boots on the ground, and it does try to control, depending on who's in charge and things. It's quite interesting.
Okay, I hope that answers your question, C. Tava. That was quite in depth and obviously very interesting to listen.
Well, I hope so.
Yeah, it's like personally, it was interesting for me to know that there was a World War II like event, but not based based on one country. Do you know what? I don't want to say what exactly happened in World War II, because the last video that I made where I had mentioned that, it got removed. Yeah, the
6 minutes.
Yeah, the video Hitler's Escape from Argentina was removed by YouTube for
Really?
for alleged hate speech. Nothing bad was said in that video about the Jewish faith or
Yeah,
the National Socialists of Germany. But
Wow.
anyway, moving on. If someone else has anything to add on that and stop me talking.
Yeah, I mean, I can mention a few things. Of course, that had already been developed. I think that idea had been developed by the time that I joined, and there was only a few countries, of course, being involved when that had been sort of created. The whole idea of Operation Ashfall and that World War II type scenario. So when I was writing my history, I had to, of course, incorporate that because Upfelden is quite a substantial world power, as it looks like, not only in size but in influence, of course. And I remembered that the president at the time had been he was a part of what we would call a minority group. Essentially, his parents were from Otvor, and they had moved up Felden, and he was the youngest president, not only a minority, and so there was a lot of sort of social backlash with his election, and then of course these events happened, and people were begging him to stay in because he was such a good leader, and he was dealing with this extremely well, with passing legislation that would help destroy districts in Upfelden, because I know we had talked about sort of maybe tsunamis having an effect ecologically and destroying certain cities, and as well. If you look at Upfelden on the map, there's this big bay. There's like a big expanse of water there between the sort of Cape region, and we also have a state on the other side in what would be really Zagria called Kriegsland that we had won through a war, essentially some petty war a long time ago. But and I had come up with an idea that with modern travel being a thing, that every so many miles they built like this man-made island essentially, and those had been completely wiped out, and they were of course thousands of people died in this, so there was a lot of social reform and things that had to happen, and eventually this president who had been viewed as some random minority that no one really liked ended up becoming this hero of Opfelden, even though people really didn't like him. So
Okay.
I think so. It's taking you're taking the influence of an event and then making something with it, and that's part of this whole experience that I think is really enjoyable, is looking at a world event and then having the ability to have your own reaction to it that's unique from everybody else's.
Definitely. Unfortunately, we have run out of time this week for the interviews. I didn't do a proper interview this week because, to be honest, I didn't have anyone to properly interview. I know that you guys at home enjoy that. And I apologise. But this episode has been really interesting and really informative, personally for me, because even though I'm in the server, I'm going to be honest, I pay absolutely no attention to it whatsoever.
Well, we're glad you're enjoying yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm 110% enjoying myself, Dan. Obviously, I got to thank everyone at home for the continued support of the channel. I've been getting a few comments of support recently, which I haven't got previously. So I do thank everyone at home for continuing to watch, continuing to support the channel. It's honestly it gives me motivation to do more, and hopefully I'll be doing things like this a long time. The last thing I want to say is the coronavirus is obviously taking the world by storm, and I just want to have a little moment for a little moment of silence, obviously here here in this voice channel right now, and obviously with you guys at home for unfortunately the 100,000th person has died from coronavirus, and so if we could just take a moment to be silent for all these people that have unfortunately died. Okay. Understand that the coronavirus is no World War II or World War One, where we remember the dead, but it's good to be respectful to those who unfortunately have died to this virus. And remember to be safe, be out of people's way. Please wash your hands. Do not go outside unless it's absolutely necessary. only to get essential shopping. I thank everyone that's watched today. I thank the people that have been on the show today. Dan, thank you for attending.
Thanks for having me.
Joe, thank you for being here as well.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Here's to many more.
Yeah, hopefully. And Ashton, thank you for contributing pretty much nothing to the conversation.
Hey man, I'm just happy to be here.
Yeah, it's
Been
it's
great.
definitely good to
I mean,
Even if I did
hopefully,
nothing.
hopefully we've recruited you as well, maybe.
definitely.
I've been thinking about joining, like, since I've been listening in, because this is interesting, like, extremely interesting,
Yay.
and it's very nice.
Well, you know who to
Enjoy
get
it.
in contact for that, don't you, Ashton?
Yes.
Definitely. So, join us next week where the next conspiracy is going to be Atlantis, and I have absolutely no idea who I'm going to have on next week in regards to interviews. Might be more Geofiction, might be someone else. Who knows? So yeah, be safe at home amid the virus, and have a wonderful weekend.